Something is happening right now that every single person on this planet needs to understand. Not tomorrow, not after the next news cycle. Right now, today, on this very day, March 3rd, 2026, the world is in the middle of a conflict that no one can predict the ending of. The United States and Israel are at war with Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Stock markets are collapsing. And Russia and China, the two great powers that were supposed to serve as Iran's guarantors, are now being put to the ultimate test. The question that every intelligence agency, every war room, every head of state on earth is asking tonight is the same question you need to be asking. Will this stay a regional war, or are we watching the opening moves of something far, far larger? Let's go back to how we got here, because this didn't happen overnight, and if you think it did, you've missed years of slow-burning fuses. Tensions between Iran and the United States and Israel increased dramatically since the October 7th attacks and the Gaza war in 2023, which led to Israel weakening Iranian-backed militias across the Middle East, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and others. Israel and Iran exchanged strikes in April and October 2024, then fought a brief war in 2025 that included an American airstrike aimed at destroying Iran's nuclear facilities. Al Jazeera. Each escalation left Iran weaker, more isolated, and more desperate. And then, just as diplomatic backchannels were apparently gaining traction, just as a deal seemed within reach, the bombs fell anyway. On 28 February 2026, Israel and the United States launched a coordinated joint attack on various sites in Iran, codenamed Operation Roaring Lion by Israel and Operation Epic Fury by the United States Department of Defense, targeting key Iranian officials, military commanders, and facilities with the stated aim of regime change. Al Jazeera. Regime change. Let's be absolutely clear about what that phrase means. This isn't a warning. This isn't a limited strike to send a message. The goal, stated openly, is to tear the government of a sovereign nation of 90 million people out by its roots. And what makes that even more politically explosive is what we know happened just before the bombs fell. On February 25th, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated that a historic agreement with the United States was within reach. Al Jazeera. And then 72 hours later, Washington launched the largest military operation in the Middle East since Iraq 2003. The scale of what has been unleashed is almost incomprehensible. Around 2,000 strikes have been conducted by Israel and the U.S. up to March 1st alone, with operations focused on three military priorities: suppressing Iranian air defenses, degrading Iran's capacity to retaliate, and disrupting Iranian command and control. The Washington Post, Israel's Air Force, says it dropped more than 1,200 munitions across 24 of Iran's 31 provinces in a single day. Wikipedia. Key government and symbolic sites in Tehran have been struck, including the state broadcaster and a UNESCO World Heritage Landmark. The death toll has topped 787 people, including Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself. NPR. The man who led the Islamic Republic for over 3 decades, eliminated. And Washington is not done. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has warned that the hardest hits on Iran are yet to come. NPR. But here is where the story stops being just a military story and becomes a global one. Because Iran did not fold. Iran hit back, and it hit back everywhere. Tehran responded by launching waves of missiles and drones at Israel and towards several military bases in the Middle East where U.S. forces operate. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced it had launched attacks on 27 bases in the Middle East where U.S. troops are deployed, as well as Israeli military facilities. Wikipedia. The IRGC then made a move that sent shockwaves through the global economy. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps declared the Strait of Hormuz officially closed, threatening to set fire to any vessel attempting to pass. NPR. This is one of the most consequential decisions any nation has made in modern history. 1/5 of the world's oil, gone from the market in an instant. The financial damage started immediately. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped more than 1,000 points on the 4th day of the conflict. European stocks fell sharply, with the Pan-European Stock 600 extending heavy losses across banking, insurance, and mining sectors. More than 1 million people were caught in travel chaos as 1,900 flights were canceled in and out of the Middle East, with major hubs like Dubai effectively paralyzed. Al Jazeera oil supertanker rates hit all-time highs, and the Iranian strikes weren't limited to military targets. Iranian missiles targeted the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain's Jufair area, Dubai's Burj Al Arab Hotel, Jebel Ali Port, and Abu Dhabi's International Airport. 2 drones also hit the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, causing a fire and forcing the U.S. to close its embassies in both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. CNBC Dubai, a city that has spent decades positioning itself as a neutral global hub, one of the safest cities on Earth, is now under attack. Now we turn to the 2 names everyone wants to talk about: Russia, China, Iran's so-called strategic partners, the nations that were supposed to deter exactly this kind of scenario. So where are they? Russia condemned the U.S. and Israel's attack, calling it a pre-planned and unprovoked act of armed aggression against a sovereign and independent UN member state, accusing the 2 nations of plunging the Middle East into an abyss of uncontrolled escalation and warning of a possible humanitarian, economic, and possibly radiological catastrophe. Al Jazeera strong language. Russia and China jointly requested an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council, where China's foreign minister called for an immediate ceasefire and the resumption of talks. House of Commons Library. But here is the brutal, uncomfortable truth that every Iranian general sitting in a bunker right now is grappling with. Words are not weapons. Officials from Russia and China have condemned the US-led strikes, but stopped short of pledging military or civilian support to Tehran. Despite the Russian Foreign Ministry's condemnation, neither the Kremlin nor President Vladimir Putin has spoken publicly on the situation. CNBC, think about that. The Kremlin, silent. Russia's public posture has been one of sharp rhetorical condemnation, but Russia will obviously not enter into any kind of military confrontation with the US and Israel, nor has it sent Tehran the least sign that it may provide any form of support. The key words for Moscow right now are strategic hedging. Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. The reason is cold, hard military reality. Years of grinding war in Ukraine have hollowed out Russia's capacity to project power beyond its borders. With its military overstretched and its economy under sustained pressure from Western sanctions, Moscow's influence in the Middle East is set to diminish further. Democracy Now! What Russia is actually doing, beneath the rhetoric, is far more calculated. Russia is seeking to preserve bargaining space with Washington on other issues, not least the negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, and is hoping to use the U.S. distraction in the Middle East to push the war in Ukraine out of the media spotlight. Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China, Moscow, is playing chess while Tehran burns. And here's an even more uncomfortable reality. Russia has already internalized the production of weapon systems it once sourced from Iran, including domestic production of Shahed-style drones. This reduces the short-term operational risk to Moscow should the conflict in Iran become protracted. Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. In other words, Russia has quietly made itself less dependent on Iran, and that changes everything about Moscow's willingness to risk confrontation with the United States on Tehran's behalf. China's position is even more strategically cold-blooded. Beijing's position is, first, immediately stop the military operations. Second, return to dialogue and negotiation. Third, jointly oppose unilateral actions. But what China is not saying out loud is equally revealing. Bloomberg has reported that China is actually pressuring Iranian officials to avoid any action that would disrupt Qatari gas exports or other shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. CNBC China is telling Iran, the country it publicly supports, to keep the oil flowing. Because China imported more than 80% of Iran's exported oil in 2025. Beijing doesn't want a war. It wants cheap energy, and it wants to be the power that picks up the pieces when this is over. A weakened Iran, paradoxically, may suit Chinese interests. The weaker the Iranian regime gets, the more diplomatically, economically, and technologically dependent on China it will become. Democracy Now! China is watching the United States do the demolition work and positioning itself as the future landlord of a restructured Middle East. There is, however, one wild card that could change the entire calculation, and it's already in the water. Russia, China, and Iran were set to hold their recurring joint naval training exercise, Maritime Security Belt 2026, in the Strait of Hormuz, And both Russia and Iran have described this exercise as highly relevant in light of current events. As the U.S. flows assets toward the Middle East, including the Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group, having Russian or Chinese warships in these waters amid a U.S. attack on Iran carries both military and political implications that Pentagon planners must address. CNBC. If a Russian or Chinese vessel is anywhere near a U.S. strike and there is an incident, accidental or otherwise, the entire calculation changes overnight. One miscalculation, one stray missile, one destroyed ship flying the wrong flag. That is how regional wars become world wars. So what happens next? Where does this end? Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, speaking on Fox News, claimed Operation Epic Fury would create the conditions for the Iranian people to form their own democratically elected government and free themselves from the current regime. CNBC, but analysts across the political spectrum are deeply skeptical. Iran now has a massive leadership vacuum. Its supreme leader is dead, its top military commanders have been killed, and no clear successor structure has emerged. Under Iran's constitution, when the supreme leader position becomes vacant, a provisional three-member leadership council assumes duties until a replacement is formally appointed by the Assembly of Experts. Al Jazeera. But that process assumes institutional stability, and right now Iran's institutions are under 2,000 airstrikes. Who takes control next? And what that person decides to do with Iran's remaining military assets is the single most dangerous unknown variable on the planet right now. The UN Atomic Energy Agency head urged a return to diplomacy, warning of increasing risk to nuclear safety in the region, House of Commons Library, while also noting that as of March 2nd, there was no indication that any nuclear installation had been hit or damaged, yet. The word yet is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because if that changes, if a nuclear facility is struck or leaks, you enter a category of crisis that no geopolitical framework is remotely prepared for. The next 72 hours are the most critical in years. Watch whether a new Iranian leadership figure emerges and reaches for a ceasefire, or chooses escalation to prove legitimacy. Watch whether Russia quietly facilitates back-channel diplomacy with Washington to extract concessions on Ukraine in exchange for pressure on Tehran. Watch whether China makes a concrete economic move, not military but financial, to reopen the Strait and protect its own oil supply. Watch Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has already reopened that front. And watch the markets, because right now the global economy is telling us something that the politicians haven't fully admitted yet. This conflict has already broken out of the Middle East, and its consequences are landing on every country on Earth. This is the most significant geopolitical moment since the end of the Cold War. Two nuclear-armed superpowers are watching a third nation get dismantled, and they are choosing, so far, to watch. How long that lasts depends on what happens next, and what happens next depends on decisions being made in bunkers, war rooms, and palaces in the next 24 hours. Stay locked in, share this, because history doesn't wait for you to catch up, and right now, history is moving faster than anyone predicted.